Hello everyone, welcome. This right here, right now, is the Joy Being live stream. Where are we? Over here. The Joy Being live stream coming to you live from Brooklyn, New York, and this is my wonderful wife, Raquel.
Hi.
Hi. So we're here, ready to rock and roll. We have a new idea, which might be, if we're lucky, to have Raquel visiting us on Fridays. It'll be so wonderful. So let me know right now. Can you hear me? Am I audible? That's the big question for me. Tomalon says, am I late? I hope not. We're right here. Tomalon, let us know if we're fully audible, fully visible, all of those things. We have a new mic set up. Perfectly audible. That's good to hear.
Yay.
We have this new mic set up. There's fewer steps in between. Hopefully maybe we got rid of one consistent problem that we were having. So welcome, folks. Great to see you. So we're going to be doing a little bit of a conversation around the multiple self model. And so we wanted to have us both here because we are multiple selves. A bit low. Okay, I can turn that up. Okay. How about... Okay, it's, volume just went up, so be careful, folks. Okay, it's a bit low. How about now? Okay, so we are going to be talking about multiple self, and so we thought it would be fun to have you here. And we are two different selves. So, or numerous selves.
Two systems of selves.
Two bundles of selves. They're like a bundle of joy, except two of them mashed together, having to deal with life. Okay, so... we're going to do our regular thing, which is we're going to chit-chat, we're going to meditate, and then we are going to do Q&A, and we're going to do a little bit of a talk on multiple self, what that means, how to approach it, how to interact with it in general. And yeah, that's basically it. So as we're getting warmed up here, folks, let us know where you're coming from. I know that we have Nick here coming to us. Nick, how are you feeling? Hopefully your cold has gone away, and hopefully life is feeling a little bit easier. Yeah, we're going to be diving in. We usually takes people like 10 minutes or so to get on because they usually want to skip the, well, not usually, but sometimes they want to skip the beginning part, so they'll trickle in. Yeah, let us know how your cold is doing. So we're going to meditate for about 25 minutes, and then we are going to chit-chat about that. Hello, Tom from the Shinzen group. Welcome. Good to see you here. It's so funny because it doesn't have you listed as one of the participants, but here you are. So good to know. Nice to see you. Okay, great. And we're going to, do you want to guide? Do you want me to guide?
You guide.
Okay, I'll guide. I'll guide as per usual. So we're going to be doing one particular way of how to have contact with multiple self. We're going to be using a metta practice, a loving kindness practice. Yeah, Friday vibes, exactly. That's the, that's where, this is Friday vibes. Welcome to Friday vibes. So yeah, that's what we're going to be doing. Then we'll begin.
Ding!
Okay. Beginning by taking a few comfortable deep breaths and just feeling the body rise and fall. Beginning by sweeping through the body to be sure we're not holding any undue tension. So starting at the top of the head, relax the brow. Relax the eyes. Allow the face to go smooth. Relax the back of the tongue and allow the jaw to go slack. No need to hold it closed. As you relax the neck and the shoulders, noticing that each time we relax a part of the body, we may feel it drop just a millimeter or so towards gravity. Relaxing the upper arms, the elbows, forearms, wrists, and relaxing the hands. letting go of any attempt to control the breath, just letting the body breathe as it will. And noticing the natural tightening and relaxing of the upper chest and upper back as the breath comes and goes. Relaxing the belly and the lower back. Relaxing the hips and the upper legs, the knees and calves, the ankles, and relaxing the feet. And then tuning into relaxation throughout the entire body. And seeing if we can connect with all of the relaxing sensations in the body without looking for any particular sensations. So we're connecting with the large field awareness, getting a sense of all body sensations together. If we're pulled into any particular sensation, just letting awareness widen to include it within the larger pool of body sensations. And beginning to rest in this large open awareness. Noticing that we have various body sensations, sensing experiences, emotion. And then we have the part of the mind which is aware of these things. It simply knows what's occurring. We can have the experience of a self. And it can feel like we are that self, or we can zoom out and simply notice this self as a set of experiences occurring to an ordinary human body mind. There they are, those self sensations. And so we'll begin by simply noting anytime we have a sense of experience of self, me, mine, the person to which it seems like this experience is occurring. Often the experience of self is felt as though it's happening in the center line of the body, maybe behind the eyes or in the chest. This is the character that we imagine has experienced our entire life. This is what we often just refer to as me. And so we can alternate noting in the mind self when we detect anything that fits this set of categories. I'm doing this for a bit just to get used to the experience of self. We detect self, say the word self in the mind, soak in, let go, and start the process again. And we can also zoom out as though we were observing from the outside. And observe this self occurring, being aware of the self, not being the self. Simply noticing it, the part of us that knows a selfing experience is occurring. Rather than a self being at the center of our experience, the self being there, that place where self occurs, wherever that is for us at this moment. Zooming out so we can have a perspective on the selfing experience. Now we're going to do a mild evoking practice. We're going to call up a certain aspect of self, the part of us that can feel a bit of resentment, annoyance, frustration. And we're going to pick a phrase that will often trigger the mind to feel that annoyance or resentment. One that works in my mind is, "How dare you? How dare you?" Just using this phrase a few times, not getting overwhelmed, just letting the system light up a little bit with a little self-righteous indignation. Just repeating the phrase, whatever works for us. How dare you? And allowing ourselves to identify with this position. In effect, we're allowing the mind to bring itself into frustration, introducing a little bit of chaos, some agitation. But not pushing too far, not getting ourselves really terribly upset. Just touching into that experience. And letting go of any mental audio and just connecting again with the experience of self and noticing that this self manifestation is different. It's likely that we had a bit less activity before, so just noticing this potentially slightly more agitated self, maybe highly agitated self, is different. It's not good or bad. And there it is. That's the shape it's taking. That's where this self is located. Noticing that by doing this, we slide back into this zoomed out awareness. There's the agitated, frustrated self. By contrast, this self is more agitated, more frustrated, more potentially resentful, stronger emotion than the previous self we had contact with. We might even notice that this more agitated self might even have a different relationship to the world. We might read our current experience as agitating, frustrating. It might pull us more easily into distraction. Again, it's not bad. It's simply some of the qualities of whatever particular self is arising for us now. Now, if it's available, coming in contact with a kind, loving self. Perhaps one that can encompass all of these self-experiences, that doesn't need them to be different. We've discovered that one self, one part of us, is frustrated, can be resentful or agitated. So seeing if we can connect with a different part of ourself, a self that doesn't need anything to be different. And because it doesn't need anything to be different, its nature is a kind of accepting compassion, an awareness that simply knows what's occurring. Can simply hold all these experiences gently together, just noticing. Maybe other selves are arising. Maybe a self that feels like we're not doing well or this is going terribly. Whatever's there, simply recognizing and accepting it as a self or a part of a self. And as we stay in contact with these various selves, allowing a little bit of light to enter the eyes, and eventually allowing them to rest on one point as they fully open. as we're here sitting with our eyes open. Perhaps connecting with a more worldly self, the self we usually navigate the world with. Just looking back at whatever selves have arisen in the last few minutes, and letting that open, kind awareness, letting that be our teacher, showing us how we might bring this practice into every aspect of our lives. Okay. If you're just joining us, you may notice that our timer is off. That's because I forgot to put it on until about 5 minutes into the meditation. Okay, so we're back. Welcome, folks. Welcome, folks who are joining us. Oh my God, we have Jizza on the line. I wonder if it's the real Jizza.
Probably.
Probably. The likelihood.
Likelihood is high.
Yeah, exactly. Welcome, folks, as you're joining us. We have our delightful co-host here, who I'm trying to finagle into doing more Fridays. But for now, we have one Friday, which is my favorite part. It's right now. And this is my lovely wife, Raquel. And we're very happy to be here with you. We're very happy to be chatting about self, multiple selves. Let me turn this audio up a little. Okay, hopefully that's a little louder for folks. Hopefully it's not too loud. Let me know. So first we'll just start with reports. What was that like? What happened? And what do you like now? Let us know what that meditation was like. Sometimes when I guide meditations, it can be, I don't want to say overly presumptuous, it can be a little presumptuous. We'll presume that you can drum up that sort of resentful self, or that you can observe it from the outside. But I don't want anyone to feel like if that was not easy or, right there on the surface, that you did anything wrong. I should also mention, which I forgot to mention, if you came for our last live stream, I wasn't here.
Forgot about that.
Yeah, I forgot about that too. It's been so long ago. I had to bring our dog very suddenly to the vet. It was a false alarm as far as we know. There's no, there was no real danger, but it seemed like there was a danger. So, but she was fine. I think she was okay. So I apologize for not being here. I tried, trust me, I tried. Ask Tomlin. I asked more than a dozen times to go live on my phone. It just didn't work. And there's like a few, I erased most of them, but there's a few clips of me being like, is this live? I can't. And it shuts off. So whatever. Very glad. Could you show her on the stream? I'm not sure what that means.
The pupples?
Oh, the puppy. Yes, we can show her on the stream. In fact, we'll do that in a minute, because since we have two people, it's not dead air if I walk away to go grab the pup. So we want to hear some any reports people have before we jump into talking more explicitly about multiple selves. So please let us know. What was that practice like? Reasonable Sentence here mentions that it was like purification in the TMI system. That's exactly right. Very closely related. In fact, in the TMI system, they talk about these as sub-minds. So these are what we might call sub-minds. Nick says, interesting, Friday fun day. That's the goal. Or like BFF, Brain Fog Friday. Yep. By the way, is purification reframing of old trauma, recalling memories, and not getting caught in old emotion? What do you think, Raquel? And
is purification a reframing of old trauma, recalling memories? I'm a little confused by the question.
I think I understand that. So if I understand the question correctly, the question is purification, as mentioned by Tom a moment ago, or I don't know if actually, am I wrong? That's not Tom. Okay, it's Reasonable Sentence mentioned a moment ago. Part of what we were doing was purification. Nick, I believe, is saying, is, if this is purification, is the definition of purification then reframing old trauma, recalling memories, but not getting caught up in them? And so I think it's you go ahead, but it's a bit broader than that. We're being a little loose with our terms, but go ahead.
Yeah. I think that can be a facet or manifestation of purification, and I think it can encompass more than that also. I would say personally, I have the experience of purification whenever internal material, so like see in, feel in, hear in, mental audio, emotion in the body, mental images can arise, and there's very little resistance to it. And it feels like in that process of allowing the inner system to activate, allowing these inner arisings to occur without a lot of resistance to them, there is a releasing of some gripping that's related to that content. So for me, equanimity is a really big piece of this purification process, this capacity to allow the inner content to arise and just to flow through. And it really often feels like it just flows through and disappears, diffuses into nothingness. And then there can be a sense of greater lightness following that. In the body and the mind, like some of the conflict, gripping, weightiness can be released through that process.
Yeah. And I'd be curious what you think, because when I've talked about purification, I talk about the taste of purification. I've actually, on a very small scale, have just associated that actually with just any insight, any contact with the present moment. When I talk about, like, people say, well, how do I know if I'm progressing? You'll say, well, you can taste the insight. Like, is there the taste of insight, which is just the system knowing the present moment very clearly, and that clarity, it just feels like the system is transforming, growing, something is being sort of clarified.
Totally.
And do you see a connection between those
two?
Yeah,
absolutely. I feel like there's a similar subjective phenomenological flavor in there. And I think in TMI, specifically when he talks about purification, he talks about it at like a particular point in the process, often where there is traumatic content, more psychologically related content arising. So I feel like this is part of where we're getting into like parsing terms from just like a common sense, like what feels like purification in place versus like in this system, this word is defined in X way.
If people don't know, TMI refers to The Mind Illuminated, which is a book written by a teacher named Chula Dasa, who there's been some strange stuff which we won't get into, but it's I feel like I don't know how to even mention him anymore without saying, well, there's been some activity. Anyway.
Yeah, I think it's important to mention every time.
It's not just like weird. Okay. Yeah, I think it's important. So we won't get into the details, but there's been some stuff. You can figure it out on your own. Okay, so let's see.
I'm not wearing my glasses.
I'll read it to us. So Lice 991803, I'll just call you Lice. Lice says, both the resentful and the kind self felt much more expansive than the neutral self experienced in the larger portion of the body. Interesting. And wait, can I ask a clarification?
Yeah, the clarification.
So clarification I'd be curious about is when you talk about the neutral self, you say the resentful self and the kind self. So the neutral self, are you referring to when we were trying to sort of trigger awareness, this sort of sense of sort of a gentle knowing from the outside, or were you talking about just when we started talking about self at the beginning? Because we started saying there's the experience of self, there's the experience of that which knows the self, and then we did resentful self and loving self. So there's actually kind of 4 entities in there. I'd be curious which you mean, neutral or not. Maybe let us know here. Let me see if you've already let us know here. Let us know below what you meant by that, and then I think we can answer probably a little more clearly. And we'll answer some other things and then come back to it.
Yeah, because I was wondering also with the mention of the body, I was wondering if attention, awareness were being confined to the space that the body occupies when contacting that more neutral quality, and that could be the reason for the less expansive feeling, but we'll see.
Yeah. I mean, it might even be that with the other selves, there's how would I was just thinking about something basically like more identification, or more like, oh, actually, I mean, the resentful self would make sense because it's sort of about our relationship with the world. It's like this in-out thing, so it could actually feel like it needs to touch the world in order to sort of even have its zhuzh, or have whatever its thing is. Anyway.
I feel like this is also, language and meditation stuff is so interesting because like we have all these terms and we talk about them as though we all know what each other are talking about, but sometimes we're really talking about different things. So like when I hear the word expansive, I think of like roomy, spacious, light feeling awareness. But then hearing you talk about resentment, I also realize like in anger, there's often a quality of force pushing out. And so I'm also now wondering, is that part of what's being described in expansiveness, like a sense of pushing out? So many questions,
which this is a great time to mention that we have a voice Discord. We also have a very, hopefully Tamalin is nearby. If you wouldn't mind putting the link to the Discord in here, so that if people do want to have an audio conversation, they can. It might be a little easier to ask questions. Let's see here. Reasonable sentences. It is Tom. So Nick then says, mine kept asking, how can you zoom out and observe self? Very interesting. Isn't that just another self who thinks it is behind it all, watching the others? Seems like you're stuck in this one body mind perception of sensation, not necessarily to identify with it perhaps, but that's another story, I guess. So I was, our friend Daniel Ingram, I was talking to him and saying, there's something, I really like this multiple self model we're doing, and it's this thing where we're asking people to identify with awareness to some degree. We're saying, okay, awareness is something that you could use to identify with. And I said it's a little problematic because ultimately, we're to some degree trying to let go of identification in general. And then he was like, yeah, but if we could get the world to identify with awareness, we'd be in a much better place.
And my experience has been that in this system, there is a particular quality of awareness that is encouraged to be like the leader or the most common observer, like the habitual observer, and that there is less of the quality of identification and selfing in that way of being, and much more actually of a quality that we often associate with experiences of non-self, of actually just being in flow, allowing sensations to arise, even allowing like the productions of speech and action to arise in a spontaneous way. So there can be a way of being that is emanating from this spontaneous, openly aware place that feels less identified.
Yeah. And just to zoom out a little bit, this is closely related to what we talk about as the experience of awareness. When we talk about the difference of attention and awareness, which is something that the TMI folks popularized. It was around since ancient times, but it was more popular through that. Awareness itself, if we can connect with this sort of larger, zoomed out experience that doesn't care as much about the edges between things, but it's often experienced as very neutral. In a sense, we're connecting with that so that thing which just knows, just one of its qualities, whatever is occurring, it doesn't matter what's occurring, it knows that thing is occurring. If awareness is present. One of the ways we'll show people awareness is to say, okay, right now, can you tell if you're seeing? Yes, pretty straightforward. Can you tell if you're hearing? Yes, pretty easy. Can you tell that you're feeling, that you have a physical body? Yes, pretty straightforward. Each of those is very different. Seeing, hearing, and feeling are very different, but each time something new that you could detect that. Okay, yes, this is what's occurring. So that knowing is very neutral, and so that knowing doesn't actually, it has very little space for identification. So there's less room for self, and it's part of why it nudges you towards a no-self experience, because self can't really live there.
And I feel like I'm like the language lady today. But I feel like this is another place where language is really important and potentially really confusing. So we're using the language of multiple selves, or connecting with these different selves. I think the language of parts can sometimes help with some of this confusion, disambiguate a little bit, because often in meditation context, particularly Buddhist meditation context, when we talk about self, we are often actually talking about that quality of identification and the quality of coagulating singular, extended through time, essential me-ness, which is not actually what we're talking about. I think part of the
when we say awareness,
when we say, and even when we talk about these parts, like one of the magic moves is that it's possible to watch these parts arise. Each of the parts has its own little personality, without the quality of identification with it. So the parts can arise without selfing arising with them. And actually noticing the multiplicity of the mind, that there are all these sub-minds or parts, can really help to chip away at that sense that there's one me that's always been, that's just me, this like identified, contracted sense that the mind is me.
Yeah. And in a recent class, we were just talking about contrast and how we really detect everything through some degree of contrast. The example I always give is that you can hear my voice because there's not 1,000 of my voices. My voice is here because it's surrounded by silence. In the same way, there's different ways to have contact with the experience of self. You can go atomically in and say, okay, what is self built out of? Okay, it's a little bit of this, a little bit of that, and it just sort of falls apart. And self becomes much less solid experientially. What we're describing is a similar sort of outcome to some degree, but a different tact where we're actually zooming out and saying, oh, look, there is a self. Maybe I can see the shape of the self or sort of where it's located in the body. And then compare it to a different self. Maybe, okay, sometimes I'm really resentful, or sometimes I feel so hopeless, whatever. To notice, oh, there are these different selves. Each time they sort of manifest. And in those moments, they tend to say that they're the one true self. The mind often will be like, I'm the one self. Isn't that interesting? Because right now, like Nick mentioned, we're observing that from the outside. So I'm not that self, but that self still says it's the number one thing. So we're zooming out to actually notice there are several selves, or there have been several selves throughout our lives that are always, doing these things. And yet each time the slide changes in the image, there's still the overlay is like, that's me. And then it's a new self and it's like, well, that's me. And it always does that. So we're effectively zooming out to see the larger context. And that zooming out is closely related to awareness, the actual zooming out to see, oh, there can be a self, fully formed self arising, and I don't have to be it at any given time.
A lot of this stuff is based on the work of internal family systems, that model, which was developed by a guy named Richard Schwartz. And in that system, they talk about this in terms of blending. So when a part is acting like it's the truth and it's all of everything and it's me, we could say that we're blended with that part in that moment.
Identified.
It's basically identified. It's basically like awareness is identified with this part. And a big part of the work in this system is learning to unblend with these parts so that there can be this quality of like vast, curious, calm awareness watching each of the parts arise without becoming the qualities of that part.
Yeah. Another example, this is something really important that Raquel and I often turn to, especially when helping people around relationships, is like right now I can tune into, I don't even want to call it a self. We usually refer to it as the bond, but it's our relationship. And I can pay attention in my mind, I don't even know what, but I can pay attention to the bond between us. And I can say, okay, this is the experience of the bond. It often feels really good. Okay, here's the bond. This is the degree to which we are bonded and connected. Like we got married, that made the bond a little stronger. We had an argument earlier today about something, I forget what it was, but that like had a little...
You stepped on my foot.
Oh, I stepped on her foot. I was like getting ready. It's so little space here that I like stepped on her foot. And then literally within 60 seconds I spilt water on the same foot. I was like,
why?
Yeah, exactly. So micro rupture, right? So we can detect this sort of like changing, sort of growing, sense of connection. We could call that a sort of the bonded self, even though it sort of is like weird because like, wait, it's two people. Like, what are we talking about? But we can observe that. Then I can say, okay, here's me. And as I'm describing this, I'm actually, awareness is actually pulling in to be self-identified. Okay, this is me. And I feel more separate from you as I pay attention to this. Okay, here's the normal self that or the one of the selves that the mind tends to grip towards. This is me. If I felt really self-conscious, this might be very strong. And then I can sort of let go of that and say, okay, this is you. This is who you are. And of course, I'm going to project myself onto that. I can't truly see who you are, but okay, this is you. This is you. That's not me. That's not the bond. This is the individual you. And we truly experience these different selves, these different entities. And what we're starting to do is, as we disaggregate or dislodge all of these pieces, we can start to gain the goodies of being able to zoom out, being able to say, okay, I can actually, right now what I need is more of a connection with Raquel, so I can attend to that self. Right now what I need is to explore on my own so I can connect with myself. What am I truly feeling? Right now I need to attend to Raquel because she's having a hard time and what's happening with me isn't so important. I want to make sure that she's doing okay. So we can navigate these different selves without having to be them at any particular time. So we have a lot in the chat here. I can read it too. Don't worry.
Okay.
Okay, let's see. That's a great question, though, Nick. So, tangentially, Tom says, tangentially, I experience similar sensations in yoga, qigong, and tai chi. Absolutely. I mean, really, the goal is that we were talking about we experience these sensations kind of all the time. We're always navigating either some self or some degree of more or less self. So it might be that we're experiencing non-self at any point. That's just a lower degree of any one of these particular selves.
And I think we may actually be referring back to the flavor of purification, which movement practices can be so important for that, because in my experience, part of that process of purification is allowing this like physiological force to move through and release in the body, and things like yoga, tai chi, qigong that stretch the body, allow that inner stuff to flow. It's really, I think, what Qi is referring to, and we can get a sensory perception of that force moving through the body, and these movement practices are so helpful in developing that equanimous way of being that allows those energies in the body to flow unobstructed, harmoniously.
Yeah. And we were on our honeymoon. We went ecstatic dancing a few times, which was really fun. And one of the things I noticed, I was dancing, it was all new people, doing weird dancing in the middle of the jungle with a bunch of other people. And I noticed, I was often dancing with my eyes closed. I was noticing, I was like, self is really strong right now. Self is really sort of a dominant part of this process. And just by allowing that to be there without fighting it, we also want to mention that any of these selves that's arising isn't negative. It's just nature. So okay, there's a strong self, maybe self-consciousness arising. And just by being with that, it sort of merged with the movement in the dancing, and it sort of exercised, like sort of literally, exercise physically, but also exercise like an exorcism, sort of moved that self around, because the experience of the self was sort of semi-solid, and then it kept moving with the movement of the body, and that just sort of broke down, and the difference between inside and outside sort of broke down. So I think that that's related to your mention about purification here. So Nick says, okay, so it's like letting the content to pass through, like you're transparent, not reacting. Yeah. I'm not that into the Dharma lingo. Yeah, and it's also, even people who are into the Dharma lingo, it's confusing. Like, there's so many versions and so many. So whenever you're confused about any particular word or language, ask us, because our lineage is very much like, define the word. So,
and I think there's a piece about not reacting in here. Part of the ninja move is like, the reaction's probably going to happen, and that's just part of nature. And can there be this expansive watching that can hold all of that just as sensory arising? So the initial emotion, and then maybe a reaction to that emotion, maybe a reaction to that emotion, all of that is being fully allowed and held, ideally, in this like caring awareness.
So Liz clarifies, the neutral self, usually not so emotional day to day. I missed the beginning of the meditation, and just know the recording is going to be up. We have, it's short term, I think, for like 8 days here on Twitch, and then it's full time on our second YouTube channel. So I want to have 2 links in here. Tomlin, will you give a link to our second YouTube channel? This is one where we have more long form content, our live streams, but also will you give a link? This is on our links page for the classes. It's a short video to explain internal family systems, which is where a lot of this material comes from. If you don't mind throwing those 2 links up there in the chat, that would be really helpful. So let's see. Liz says, I usually experience it in the head, but notice it expanding when getting more emotional. Interesting. Yeah, and that's a great insight, that the self isn't quite so solid and has a lot of changing going on, especially when we have an emotional experience. It can expand and feel like the I mean, that's, for me, the experience of self and I has a lot more to do with emotion. That's how I detect it. It's more in the body. I used to detect it more in the head, but now just for me happens to be more in the body. And you were mentioning that you not that you detect it here, but you access the self and multiple selves more so through the mind talking.
I feel like the way we're using the self is confusing me right now, and a little unclear. So, yes, when detecting parts, for me, it's easiest to detect parts through mental audio, because they're often like these really clear, differently toned lines of conversation in mental audio.
Yeah, and we were actually, I remember we were going to start the conversation around ambivalence, where we'll have 2 parts of ourselves. One's is like, I really want to do this big project, and the other part's like, I just want to relax. And those are great examples of selves internally sort of often conflicting. And a lot of our conflict in our life is actually these different selves trying to navigate each other.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think sometimes it can sound like sort of esoteric to be like, oh, there are all these parts within you, but it's actually something we experience all the time. Like in that moment of like, I have homework to do, I really want to be successful, also TV.
Yeah, and we're going to talk about this more. I think we might do a part 2 to this little video we're making now. But part of the premise, and this is important to know, is that each self, it has a drive, right? It's just, it wants to be famous, or it wants to be successful, or it wants to eat Cheerios all day, right? Whatever the thing it wants. And what I've been noticing, or what we've talked about before, is that the drive can be totally wholesome, but the expression of that drive can be terribly out of whack. So the drive might be, I want to feel connected with others. And the expression of that means, I'm going to drink all night long. And it's like, that was not a good idea. So a lot of the time our, worst habits are actually selves that sort of need attending to. Maybe they want comfort or safety or this kind of thing, but actually they're expressing that in a really poor way. The analogy that I use, which I was like, whoa, this is very interesting societal potential sort of piece, is that that's the same way that extremist groups work, is that the drive might be, or the pieces of information are all correct, right? Okay, so we'll just talk about some extremist groups here for a second. So, okay, yes, in the United States, there are more black and brown people than there were in the past. Fact. Okay. This person or group, I want to feel safe. Okay, that's reasonable. I want to feel like I'm part of a community. Okay, those are all reasonable things. We're going to become white nationalists. It's like, whoa, like, yes, your descriptive claims are correct. Your description of certain things are correct. Your prescriptive claims, like what should be done, is way off. So we can look at these different parts of ourselves as having wholesome drives. And if we can attend to those wholesome drives, we can often, resolve the conflict in themselves. Yeah. Excellent. Okay, so let's see here. We have a bunch more.
I also feel obligated
Please.
to say that the premises upon which extremism is based are often totally off in the category.
There's a lot of them that are. And
I think the human needs are valid. I think that's part of what we're getting at. And I would even I know this is a very slight shift, but I would talk about it more in terms of needs and jobs in the internal system rather than drives.
Okay.
Because the needs are often things like to feel safe, to feel connected. And so I think of these more as like needs that need caring rather than drive, which to me can sometimes have the connotation of like a hunger or a craving or a drivenness
sure.
that I think sounds less wholesome than need.
Well, it's funny because I'm thinking, because
job.
we keep training our puppy, and so it's like I think of just drives, like hunger drive, like play drive. It wants to play, like it just whatever. So that makes perfect sense what you're saying. And
Because
also,
sorry, go ahead.
and also, just going to say, absolutely, that extremist groups, their read on reality is often, totally whacked very clearly. And one of the reasons they are so sticky in society is they will get a few things accurate. And that's actually how they bleed into people's lives. Like, it is true, I do feel alienated. And then they say, okay, well, this is the problem. You're like, oh, no, like there is a part of it that is actually telling us the truth. And sometimes when we even hear those parts of self saying like, I want to party, we can actually look, okay, what's the need underneath
Exactly.
that? And so you can actually hear the ask and say, well, but what's underneath that?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And if that need can be met in a gentle, moderate way, often that part doesn't have to become extreme. It doesn't have to want to go to partying all night to feel connected. It's often actually when those needs are denied or belittled that they take on those extreme manifestations.
Yeah. Nick has another note here, which he's saying is a little too philosophical, but it's sort of funny. He says, quote, lose yourself and lose your contrasting sense of self and abide in awareness in 14 days or your money back. And he says, it feels like talking about something not experienced, although I still witness it all. Getting a little philosophical at the end of a long day. So guess I'm identified with parts. So yeah, just we're really careful that we want these things to not be philosophical, to be experiential. And what that means is just whatever self you're experiencing right now, just notice that is occurring. That's like the ground floor is like, okay, I'm experiencing some degree of self, some manifestation of self now. That's occurring. It's not that abstract when we just say, okay, there is the experience of self occurring now.
And when we're talking about these different parts, part of how we can get to know them is to get to know like what is their tone? What kinds of things do they say? Does it feel agitated? Does it feel peaceful? Does it feel contracted? Does it feel expansive? Does it feel is it like or is it like like some of those qualities? And that's part of how we can get in touch with like these different parts and often that will switch from moment to moment, and this is part of how we can get in touch with the multiplicity inside. Is like in that conversation around like, do I do my homework or do I watch TV? There can be like a very gruff voice that's like, well, you signed up for a PhD program, so like get at it, and then there can, in the next second, be a sort of childlike yearning voice that's like, oh, but vacation and lounging. And so tuning into like these different types of content and these different tones of communication is one way to really experientially connect with the multiplicity within us.
I don't know if anyone's picking up on this, how oddly specific that was, but that's definitely like a narration of Raquel's recent inner monologue where it's like, or dialogue, I guess, where it's like, you get to work on your PhD program. You're like, but Thailand.
Yeah.
Yeah. I hear the puppy making sounds. Do you mind?
Should I go grab her?
Do you mind? Just grab her. So we're going to see a little puppy coming soon. Let's see. Tom says, the stuff about the bond is incredibly interesting. Thanks, the two of you. Thank you for being here. Nick says, this is all very meta, Raquel. It's all very meta and meta, ideally. So has to go. Good to see you. There's a couple links that just got thrown up there to the YouTube and to our let's see, what is this one to a drive? Okay, anyway. Can all these selves just get along, Nick says? Exactly. That's a great question.
Yes, they can.
Yes, they can get along. Do people often just follow the loudest self? That is a great question, and that is highly accurate. That's just like any meditation object. People tend to notice the most, the loudest or sort of most rambunctious. I'm thinking of the dog now suddenly. They tend to notice the sort of loudest sense experience. And the same thing with the self. They tend to identify with the one that's the most dominant at any given point. So that's exactly accurate.
And like we learn from the family systems that we grow up in which selves are more loved and allowed, which parts are more disavowed and seen as bad, and we get those habits of which part dominates or leads in the mind.
Yep. I mean, something, I hope this is okay. This reminds me, this is a part thing that was you had talked about in the past, was that growing up, you got the signal that being big and being expansive and experimenting and, hey, I'm going to be strange or do what I want was sort of like, no, we don't do that.
Yeah, that's like bad in the family I grew up in. It's like, who do you think you are? And like, ew.
Yeah, which is in my family is a degree of like, you've got to be the greatest in the world to even be allowed to exist. So that's like sort of the, the drive that, or the sort of voice that I would hear in my mind. And so it's just interesting to hear these different, tendencies. Hello, Sela. Yeah, folks don't know, this is our lovely dog named Sela, which maybe Raquel, maybe you want to explain. I'm going to hold her up for the cami here.
Okay.
Maybe you want to explain what the word Sela means.
Yeah, so Sela is
the microphone got knocked.
She's so tangly.
She's all tangled up.
What a tangly baby. Sela is a Pali word, I believe. And it's often translated as morality or ethics. And it's the part of the path in Buddhism that's about growing as a person. So the Eightfold Path has 8 folds, 8 things. And those 8 things are often broken down into morality, concentration, and wisdom. And so she's named after the morality part, which is things like right livelihood, right speech, stuff like that, growing as a person.
Yeah, and you can imagine it's very encompassing. So, excuse me, you're all tangled up again. It's very encompassing. So, when you say growing as a person, well, developing your insight is growing as a person. Developing your concentration is growing as a person. So really, it's any kind of growth, any kind of self-growing. So that's part of the sort of vibe of what Sela means. And that's what she means to us.
Yeah, and I thought it was an apt name because I feel like we're going to grow in those ways by being her parents. And she has that Buddha nature.
Yeah. There's a classic story. Well, I feel like if you know this story, you know the story. But someone came up to a monk and said, hey, does a puppy have Buddha nature? Knowing that at the time the definition of Buddha nature would, of course, include a puppy. And he wanted to see the Zen master's answer. And, of course, in Zen fashion, he answered at a level that was sort of more complex than the person might understand. And his answer was surprising. He said, no. And there's a whole school of Buddhism where they just repeat the word no over and over again because of that particular koan. So, does this puppy have Buddha nature?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, folks. Lovely to see you here. Great thanks to our special guest here. Really glad that you're able to join and be with us here because it really makes a difference for the stream. Thank you so much, Sela.
Thanks for being you.
And also, and also Raquel, whatever. I'm just kidding.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Hopefully we can, again, convince Raquel to come on more often. But that's up to her and to some degree up to you. I've said this before, but it's really true. If people badger Raquel, she'll probably She'll probably listen. Okay, folks, great to see you. And look forward to chatting with everyone soon. I think I fixed the outro music. You tell me if it's the correct music this time, but I'll be able to still hear you. We can still chat for a couple minutes. I'm going to put on this outro. Thanks, guys. Thank you, Nick. And we will, that Shiva Shakti energy and Sila. Absolutely. Okay, guys, we will see you very soon. See you in less than 72 hours, actually.